The snow outside the train windows had the color of ash. Not the white of winter, but the dull gray of something that had burned too long and lost its purpose. Dr. Miriam Rosenfeld pressed her forehead to the cold glass, watching the landscape blur past. Forest, field, shadow, repeat. It could have been anywhere. It could have been nowhere. The guards in the carriage said the name Ravensbrück only once, as if saying it twice would make it real. She had been a chemist once, a real one. At the University of Prague, she'd studied molecular bonds and the quiet faith of precision. Her hands had known the comfort of glassware, not chains. She'd believed that science had its own morality, its own language. Then came the day when the language of science bent to the grammar of war. The train slowed, metal screeched against metal. From outside came the barking of dogs, the bark of orders, and the hollow rhythm of boots on frozen ground. The smell of smoke drifted in, through the cracks in the boards. Miriam did not lift her head until a soldier struck the door and shouted, "Rouse! Alice Rouse!" The women in the carriage moved as one, a murmuring mass of fear and cloth and hunger. When the door opened, light cut through them like a blade. Outside, the air stung. The world was a palette of grays and browns. Barbed wire glistened with frost. Wooden towers rose like skeletons of forgotten gods. Above the gate, the letters curved in iron, a promise. That meant nothing. They pushed forward. A guard tore numbers onto their arms with ink that felt like fire. When it was her turn, Miriam didn't flinch. She only whispered the number to herself afterward, over and over, until it felt like a prayer. 51423. They took her papers, her clothes, her hair. They left her with a dress too thin for the cold, and a tag that said laboratorium. It was almost mercy. Inside the laboratory, the air was warmer, not from kindness, but from heat lamps, and burners that never slept. Beakers, flasks, pipettes, the ghosts of her former life, lined the benches in perfect order. A smell of alcohol, ether, and perfume filled the room. The irony was unbearable. In a camp built for death, they tested beauty. The head of the lab was a German officer named Dr. Kruger, a man with clean fingernails and the confidence of someone who believed in categories. He spoke to her as one might speak to a tool. "You're trained?" he asked. She nodded. "Organic chemistry. Prague." "Good," he said. "Then you will assist with formula verification, lotion bases, emulsifiers, scent stabilizers. The Reich requires quality." Quality. He handed her a clipboard. She read the labels. Serum 13, Compound L7. Animal testing discontinued, human trials pending. Human, she repeated. Kruger's smile did not reach his eyes. "Efficiency demands realism. You will find we are very efficient here." The first time she saw the testing room, she thought she would faint. Rows of women, prisoners, shaven-headed, hollow-eyed, sat in chairs bolted to the floor. Their arms were marked with circles of iodine. Assistants applied creams and powders, while clerks scribbled on clipboard. The room smelled of lavender and blood. One of the women looked up at Miriam as she entered. Her eyes were green, too bright for this place. "Are you one of them?" the woman asked in Polish. Miriam froze. "No," she whispered, "not one of them." The guard barked at them both. The woman's name, Miriam later learned, was Anya. That night, Miriam could not sleep. The bunkhouse air was thick with coughs and whispers. Every sound was a confession. She stared at her hands, the same hands that once mixed medicine, now helping design poisons disguised as creams. She made a vow. If science could be used to destroy, it could also lie, quietly, beautifully, to protect. Her sabotage began with ratios, a slight excess of stabilizer, a shift in pH, a trace of sulfur added where none should be. Nothing overt, nothing that could be blamed on clumsiness. Just enough to ruin results, to make formulas unstable, to buy time for the women used as subjects. For weeks, no one noticed. Kruger praised her precision. The clerks recorded failures as data anomalies. But Miriam noticed. The burns healed faster. The rashes faded. The women smiled again, small, dangerous smiles that said someone is helping us. Anya, the woman with green eyes, became her silent ally. She worked in the laundry and smuggled tiny slips of paper to Miriam, lists of names, warnings of upcoming tests, messages of hope written in invisible ink made of potato starch. One note read simply, "God hides in equations too." Then came the night of the raid. The sirens wailed without reason. The guards ran shouting. Somewhere beyond the fence, distant explosions rolled across the sky. Rumors swept the barracks, Allied bombers, a supply train hit, the front moving closer. Miriam took advantage of the chaos. She crept into the storeroom, found the ledger of compound inventories, and altered the records. Formula L7, the one most toxic, she listed as depleted. The real batch she diluted to harmlessness. When Kruger discovered it days later, he flew into a rage. "Who changed these entries?" he shouted, slamming the book onto the bench. "Who touched the formulas?" Miriam kept her face still. "The records were incomplete, Herr Doctor. I only corrected them." His eyes narrowed. "Be careful, Frau Rosenfeld. Mistakes are expensive here." She nodded. "I understand." He turned and left. Only when the door closed did her hands begin to shake. That evening she saw Anya again, outside, near the fence, pretending to clean the yard. "The front is moving," Anya whispered. "They're nervous. People talk about evacuation." Miriam looked at the sky. A streak of red light cut across it, flak fire from some distant defense. She wondered if the world could still burn clean. "They won't let us leave alive," she said. "Then we'll die trying," Anya answered. For the first time in months, Miriam laughed. It was a sound so foreign to her own ears that she almost didn't recognize it. The next morning began with the sound of boots. Always boots. They struck the floor in rhythm, echoing down the corridors, a metronome of terror. The guards' shouts carried through the walls, followed by the cough of engines outside. The laboratory felt colder that day. Even the glass seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Kruger stood by the workbench with his gloves already on, his expression sharp as a scalpel. "New directive," he said. "We are to accelerate trials. The Reich demands results before winter ends. The war will be won by science, not soldiers." He looked at her when he said science, as though it were a private joke they shared. Miriam didn't answer. She lined the glass vials in perfect order, the way she used to line test tubes in Prague before lectures. Back then, the world had felt rational. Equations balanced. Reactions followed laws. But here, everything broke its own rule. A cart rattled through the doorway, pushed by two assistants. On it stood trays of labeled bottles, serum L7, compound R3, formula V9. The new formulations for testing. Kruger turned to her. "You'll oversee Group B, ensure purity, no deviations." The word purity made her stomach twist. He handed her a clipboard. "And Rosenfeld," he said quietly, "you may find comfort in knowing your work is vital. A woman of science must serve the future." She wanted to say, "Whose future?" Instead, she said, "Yes, Herr Doctor." That afternoon, the women were brought in. 12 of them this time, all younger than she remembered. They were seated, numbered, and stripped of sleeves for injection sites. The assistants moved with mechanical precision, filling syringes, recording doses. Miriam stood behind them, holding her own clipboard. Her pulse ticked like a clock too close to stopping. When the first woman flinched, she looked away. When the second whimpered, she gripped the table edge. By the sixth, she could no longer feel her own body. It was then she realized that science was no longer neutral. Every drop, every reaction, every molecule carried a moral weight heavier than any metal. When the session ended, she returned to her bench and began adjusting ratios again. Tiny, acts of rebellion hidden in decimal points. The wrong solvent here, the unstable binder there, small enough to escape detection. She poured what remained of compound V9 down the drain and replaced it with water tinted by dye. It felt like prayer. Night came fast in Ravensbrück. The barracks were dark except for the dim glow of a candle hidden inside a tin cup. Around it, the women whispered, names, memories, pieces of themselves they refused to let die. Miriam listened in silence, her back against the wall. Anya sat beside her, folding a piece of paper so small it could hide inside a shoe. "What are you writing?" Miriam asked softly. "A letter I'll never send," said Anya. "To my sister. She's in Warsaw, or maybe heaven. I want her to know I didn't forget the color of her dress." Miriam nodded. She understood that kind of letter. Words not meant for the world, but for God, in case he ever looked down again. When the candle burned out, darkness swallowed them, but the memory of light remained, like a promise kept in secret. Days passed, weeks blurred, winter thickened, the lake froze, the wind carved through walls like knives. Rumors spread that the Allies were advancing, that the camps might be evacuated, that the war might be ending. Hope was dangerous. It made people careless. One morning, Kruger summoned her early. His tone was smooth, almost kind. "Frau Rosenfeld," he said, "you were recommended for a promotion. Efficiency, intelligence, precision. You've earned the Reich's trust." The words felt like poison. He gestured to the table behind him. "We are developing a new line of compounds. Perfumes, creams, treatments for the civilian elite. You will formulate the prototypes. It's an honor." On the table lay samples, small glass jars, clear liquid that caught the light like liquid glass. She recognized the base compounds: formalin, ether, alcohol, lanolin. But one label froze her blood: A367. Experimental additive, human enzyme extract. She looked up slowly. "Where did this come from?" Kruger smiled faintly. "You're a scientist, Rosenfeld. You should know better than to ask that question." That night, she sat at her bench long after the others had left. The clock on the wall ticked with merciless precision. In front of her, the formula sheet waited, blank, expectant. She picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, and began to write equations she didn't believe in. Her mind drifted to the past, to her old lab in Prague, sunlight on glass, chalk dust floating through air, to the lecture hall where she'd told her students, "Chemistry is the study of transformation, how something ugly becomes something new." Now she wondered if she had misunderstood the lesson all along. She reached for the reagent bottle, unscrewed the cap, and added a single drop of sulfuric acid where water should have been. The reaction hissed, released a puff of smoke, then stilled. Outside, footsteps passed. The door creaked. Kruger's reflection appeared in the glass before she heard his voice. "You work late," he said. She didn't turn. "Science doesn't sleep, nor does war," he replied. He stepped closer, looking over her shoulder. "You were in Prague, yes? Under Professor Weiss?" "Yes. I've read his papers," he said. "Brilliant mind. A shame he refused cooperation. He would have lived." She kept her voice calm. "Some men die for their discoveries, others for their silence." He studied her a moment longer, then smiled without humor. "Be careful, Rosenfeld. Even silence can be treason." When he left, she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands shook too much to hold the pen again. Days later, one of the test subjects, a young woman named Clara, collapsed during an experiment. She'd been given a lotion base Miriam had altered weeks before, diluted to neutralize its acids, but something had gone wrong. Clara's breathing quickened. Her skin flushed purple, foam bubbled at her lips. The guards shouted for medics. Kruger stormed in, barking orders. "What was she given?" he demanded. Miriam's throat closed. "The standard compound," she said. Kruger turned to the assistant. "Show me the vial." The assistant hesitated, then retrieved it. The one marked L7A. Kruger held it to the light. "The pH is wrong." His voice dropped, dangerous and calm. "Who prepared this?" Miriam opened her mouth, but no sound came. Clara gasped once more, then went still. Silence fell like snowfall. Kruger turned to her slowly. "You will review every formula tonight," he said. "Every record, every entry. If there is one more discrepancy, you'll join the test group." She nodded once. "Yes, Herr Doctor." But as he left, she looked down at Clara's body, at the stillness that looked like sleep, and she understood that her war had changed. It was no longer sabotage. It was confession. That night, Miriam stayed in the laboratory long after the guards had gone. The silence pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. The lights buzzed above her, harsh and white, the sound of an empty conscience. She sat at her bench, staring at the notebook filled with her own handwriting. The lies, the adjustments, the invisible war she had been fighting one decimal point at a time. Clara's face haunted her in every reflection. One wrong drop, she thought. One mistake, and I killed her, instead of saving her. Outside, the wind scraped at the windows like fingernails. Somewhere, a guard's laughter cracked the stillness. She wanted to scream, but even that belonged to them now. She took the pen again and began to write. Not formulas this time. Words. Confession. In the language she still trusted. Chemistry. She wrote out each act of sabotage, each deliberate error, coded in molecular shorthand. If they ever found it, it would look like just another experiment. But if someone who understood read it, they would see the truth. When she finished, she hid the pages inside the hollow of a reagent cabinet. Then she washed her hands until they bled. The next morning, Kruger arrived early. His uniform was immaculate. His mood was not. He set a small metal box on the table. Inside it, a vial, clear glass, sealed with wax. "We've had too many failures, Rosenfeld," he said. "I'm told you were once a scientist of repute. Let's see if that was true." He placed a clipboard in front of her. "You'll prepare a fresh batch of compound A367, from memory, no assistance, no errors. I will observe." Her throat tightened. This was no test. It was a trap. She picked up the flask. The smell of ether rose like the ghost of her old life. Her hands trembled, but she steadied them. The guards watched from the doorway. Kruger's eyes followed her every movement. Drop by drop, she began the procedure. Acids, solvents, binders, emulsifiers. Her mind raced. Ahead of her hands, she could make it safe, neutralize the reaction before it ever formed. But if she did it too obviously, he would know. She added a few grains of stabilizer, too few to detect. The mixture hissed, then cleared. Kruger leaned forward. "Continue." She poured the final reagent. The fluid turned milky white, then transparent again. "Good," he said softly. "You see, when you stop thinking of yourself as a victim, you can serve something greater than yourself." A motion for one of the guards. "Take a sample to the testing room." Miriam froze. "Now, immediately," he said. "New subjects arrived this morning." Her heart dropped. "At least, let me run a control test first." He smiled. "No need. We trust your precision." They walked together to the testing chamber. 12 women waited, standing in a line. Anya was among them. Miriam's breath caught. She stepped forward, shaking her head. "She's not part of the medical group. She works laundry." Kruger's expression didn't change. "The list came from command. Numbers, not names. Replace her if you wish." She looked at the others. Hollow faces, bones beneath skin, souls clinging to the last scraps of meaning. How do you choose who dies first? Her hand trembled as she reached for the vial. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, innocent as water. Anya's eyes met hers, calm, almost peaceful. "It's all right," she whispered. "If not me, it will be someone else." Miriam shook her head violently. "No!" Kruger's voice cut through the air. "Proceed, Rosenfeld!" The guard loaded the syringe. Time slowed. The needle glinted under the light. Miriam stepped forward, placing herself between Anya and the guard. "Wait," she said. "I'll do it." Kruger raised an eyebrow. "Very well. Demonstrate your skill." Her fingers were ice. She drew the liquid into the syringe. Each motion was mechanical, practiced, hollow. She knelt beside Anya, whispering, "Forgive me." Anya's whisper came back like a prayer. "For what? For surviving?" Miriam hesitated, then pressed the plunger halfway, only enough to let air touch the skin. The needle left no mark. Kruger watched from across the room, suspicion flickering. "Faster," he said. She nodded and turned away to prepare the next vial. Her heart pounded so loud she thought it might be heard. And then, a crash. The assistant tripped, the tray fell, the vials shattered. A smell of alcohol and acid flooded the air. The guard cursed, stooping to clean the shards. Kruger moved toward the mess, shouting orders. In the chaos, Miriam acted. She took the syringe meant for the next subject and plunged it into her own arm. The liquid burned instantly. It was not the neutralized compound. It was pure. Her body seized. She gasped, hands clawing at the table. Kruger turned, eyes wide. "What have you done?" She tried to speak but could not. Her mouth filled with the taste of metal. The last thing she saw was Anya's face, not afraid, just radiant with shock and sorrow. They said she died within minutes. The guards called it madness. Kruger called it sabotage. He ordered her body removed, her lab sealed, her notes confiscated. The cabinet where she had hidden her coded confession was emptied and burned, or so they thought. But one single page, slipped through the fire. It clung to the back of another document, unnoticed until months later, when the war collapsed around them. The camp was quiet now. The towers were gone. The fences had rusted down to memory. Grass had grown over the ashes. A young researcher named Dr. Elise Koenig walked through what remained of the laboratory. She was part of a commission documenting Nazi medical crime. Her hands shook as she turned over a crate of forgotten papers, brittle with age. Among them, a scrap of parchment, yellowed, water-stained, scrawled in the language of chemistry. She held it up to the light. The handwriting was small but steady. The equations looked like any other. Molecular bonds, reaction chains, pH notations, but in the margin, faintly written in Hebrew, were 5 words: "Truth has no formula." Elise copied the note into her ledger, not yet realizing what she'd found. Years later, she would trace the name Miriam Rosenfeld to university archives in Prague, a chemist, a prisoner, a number, 51423. In 1956, when the Ravensbrück Memorial was opened, they displayed a single vial in the glass case. It was found buried in the ruins near the lab, still sealed, the wax intact. Inside, the liquid was clear. Tests showed it to be harmless, distilled water. On the label, faint and almost erased, one word could still be read: hope. They said she died in silence, but silence is never empty. It carries what words cannot, the choice to resist even when no one sees. In a world that worshipped destruction, she made one final experiment, to see if courage could still change matter, if faith could turn poison into peace. And perhaps it did, because somewhere in that camp, the formulas stopped working. The results never came. The Reich's science failed, and the only equation that survived was written not in numbers, but in mercy. If this story moved you, remember, every name, every act of courage keeps their voices alive. Subscribe to Voices from the Camps and help us keep telling the stories history tried to silence. Because memory is the last form of resistance.